Afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew, Colonel Holowchak, and Thomas Jefferson scholar, philosopher, historian, prolegomενist, among other things. And today I have another edition of The Real Thomas Jefferson. I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson as an epistolist, as a letter writer. Why is that? Well, with my last video titled roughly The Fable of Thomas Jefferson Sally Hemings, How It Took Root at Monticello, I received quite a few emails from people. I name a few: Matt Coyle, Margaret Hemingway, and young Adrian Zolkover. And Adrian sent me a couple very long epistles, which were fun to read. And I tell you, I don't get necessarily monetary return for what I do on Thomas Jefferson. But it's wonderful, I have to admit, to be able to read letters from people who have watched the video or read something I wrote and have something nice to say. So I want to thank you all for that. So what I thought I'd do today, given I think Thomas Jefferson's a great Southerner, a great American, and a great person, a very large man, just as a cosmopolitan figure, I want to talk about Jefferson's letters, Jefferson as a letter writer, to be more specific, right? So let's begin with a letter on June 1, 1822, that Thomas Jefferson writes to John Adams. And Jefferson is 79 years old at the time, and that might not seem by today's standards to be that old, but in his day, people didn't live that long. John Adams was older than Jefferson. So he writes to Adams of nonagenarian, someone over 90 or over, Charles Thompson. And he talks of Thompson being cheery and slender, but he suffered the effects of drudgery, his debilitation through old age, mental and physical and so forth. That Thompson, Jefferson says, scarcely recognized anybody in his own household. And Jefferson writes, with such a life, with one's faculties decayed, with pleasant sensations closed in athamy, debility, and malaise in their places, and with all of one's friends of youth gone, he says, that life amounts to nothing better than the life of a cabbage, not worth a wish, says Jefferson. And he says at such a time, Jefferson is not a bad thing. Jefferson is certainly not, death is not an evil, I should say, not Jefferson. Death is not an evil. Jefferson is something to be welcomed, something to which one should look forward. Right? Now, there's a subsequent letter to Adams that Jefferson writes in June 27, 1822. And Jefferson tells Adams of the persecution of letter writing, right? He pines for retirement, which is quiet, where he doesn't have to, write letters and so forth. But he mentions that in spite of that, I dutifully answer all letters sent to me that require an answer. Not that everyone asks for a letter back, but he has a sense of duty here. He says civility requires answers. Those are his words, right? And in an 1820 letter, he tells Adams that he has received 1,267 letters. That amounts to close to 4 letters per day. And he says many of them requiring answers of elaborate research, and all to be answered with due attention and consideration. He says, is this a life? He writes, at best, it's but the life of a mill horse who sees no end to his circle, but in death, mill horse being a horse that moves around and grinds wheat or some such thing. To such a life, that of a cabbage is paradise. It occurs then that my condition of existence truly stated in that letter, this one, June 1, 1822, if better known, might check the kind indiscretions which are so heavily oppressing the departing hours of life. Such a relief would, to me, be an ineffable blessing. Okay. Jefferson is complaining about the labors of letter writing. Now, notice he said a lot of them require due attention and consideration. And I add here is that Jefferson had built for himself a rotating stand on top of a table where he could put on book holders. This would twirl around, and he would have up to 4 or 5 books on the book holder, several different book holders, which would twirl around so that he can be looking at 3 or 4 books at a particular time while he's doing research. Why I say that is some of the letters that, if you're familiar with his letters, some of Jefferson's letters really were like small research papers where he's going into his libraries and he's doing some research on the issue to try to help his correspondent, right? Now, letter writing, of course, probably doesn't mean much to us today. Many of us, especially the younger ones, have probably never even written a letter with pen in hand. I do have um, different types of dipping ink, and I have dipping pens, and I use that not on a daily basis, but quite often. I keep a journal. I've finished over 90 journals of my life. How interesting they are, that's not for me to say, but I love to have a, I don't know if I have one with me, I don't, but I love to take a dipping pen, put it in ink and then write and so forth. And there's a feel that you get for the paper, for the ink, for the pen, and everything that you don't get with a regular mechanical pencil or mechanical pen or some such thing. Now, since today we Skype, we email, we right, we text and things like that, we don't really have time to write a letter. And there's something lost, I add. There's an intimacy to letter writing in the way Jefferson wrote letters, in the way I used to write letters earlier in my life when I was younger. I remember at a time when I went to University of Pittsburgh to work on my PhD, and I had left my girlfriend back in Michigan, and she would send me letters, and they were scented. How wonderful that was to get a letter, and then the first thing you do is you smell the letter, and it reminds you of the person that you love, and so forth. There's scented letters. Try scenting a text message. It doesn't work. All right, now to write so many letters, one thing that we disregard is that it was a costly affair. Paper wasn't cheap at the time, nor was ink and things like that, right? And Jefferson had tended to make duplicates of all of his letters. He had a machine set up so that he can make duplicates of all of his letters. You can see that if you ever visit the Monticello, if you want to endure the barrage of their hypocrisy as they tell you their story of Thomas Jefferson, you can do that. Anyways, Jefferson, spent a lot of time writing letters. Letter writing, I think, for him was, as I said, dutiful. My first book on Jefferson was a collection of philosophical essays. I published a couple papers on different aspects of Jefferson's philosophical thinking, and I thought, well, why not put all of these or put the essays that I wanted to write into a book, and I did. It's called Dutiful Correspondent, Philosophical Essays on Thomas Jefferson. I was overawed, I guess, at least by Thomas Jefferson's notion of dutifulness, this notion that someone writes me a letter, I'm going to write them back. I'm going to write that person back, not them. And he tended to do that when the occasion required it. And of course, he complained to Adams about that. But I think he thought that in the community of republicanism that he envisaged, the empire for liberty, as he once called it, that we had a duty to communicate with each other and share information. It was very important for Thomas Jefferson. I believe that. So I think he took letter writing very, very seriously. It was a way of promoting, as it were, liberty, promoting morality and science. And Jefferson always thought liberty and science were answerable to morality. He was first and foremost, I've always argued, and will always argue, a moralist, right? He was, as I've argued in quite a few books, I think America's loudest voice from the early Americans, from the founders, who was an advocate of liberalism, the sort of liberalism that he thought was needed in a Jeffersonian republic, right? So Jefferson, as I said, one thing to know about his letters, he was dutiful, right? I'd say if he's writing to someone like Adams or Madison, uh, or Monroe, someone to whom he often writes, he will typically start off a letter that I thank you, I received your letters from blah, blah, blah. You talk about the letters he received and respond to issues that were discussed in those letters, right? But so he was very dutiful, as I said, but he was also measured. He writes, a careful craftsman who often revised, this is not Jefferson, this is Douglas Wilson. He was a careful craftsman who often revised and rewrote his letters before sending them. Jefferson's letter writing was artful in every sense of the word, but his was always the artfulness of engagement of purpose. I like Douglas Wilson is one of the best Jeffersonian scholars. He never wrote the big book on Jefferson, but he wrote so many important letters where he did a lot of the dirty work, right? He talked about different aspects of Jefferson, the person, and he just did the historical digging that good historians do. And good historians obviously are very few in number, right? So Alan Golden, who wrote with James Golden, father and son team, they said in Jefferson's Rhetoric of Virtue, said Jefferson's measuredness was a result of sort of Ciceronian, right, model of letter writing. A Ciceronian model, it means something like letters were personal communications, right, that address specific needs and so forth. So there was a sort of intimacy, the Goldens argue, and I certainly agree with that. Now, how many letters did Jefferson write? Well, there was up to something like 19,000 letters in his life, right? Jefferson and Madison alone exchanged some 1,250 letters. The correspondence between Jefferson and John Adams was certainly less lengthy, but in many ways, it's my favorite. It was a very meaty correspondence because they covered so many very, to my mind, very interesting philosophical topics of God and truthfulness and political philosophy. They didn't agree on that, but they still wrote on that. And it really is if you want to read a correspondence between any two founding fathers, that to me is the one to read. Right. So when Jefferson got older, he relegated the time between his time he got up to breakfast to letter writing and so forth. And then after that, he would be doing things outside of Monticello on horseback, overseeing affairs on the farm or things like that, and so forth. Now, on April 5, 1823, not long before Jefferson perishes, he writes to Robert Walsh, the letters of a person, especially one whose business has been chiefly transacted by letters, form the only full and genuine journal of his life. Very important quote here. People like Pete Onuff has argued that you can't know the Jefferson at all because Jefferson was such a chameleon in his letters that he wrote to individual correspondents so personally, and without revealing at all who he was. Now, I think that's a horribly ridiculous, absurd claim. How can you write 19,000 letters to various people and not reveal anything about yourself? In contrast, it's just a ridiculous sentiment by Pete Onuff. The whole thing is Jefferson was a master at deception. And why does Onuff do that? Because he wants to argue, Jefferson's affair with Sally Hemings, right? So there's something in the background that he gets. So, Paquet, against Onuff, I argue that Jefferson's letter writings were a tableau vivant. They give us a living account, a living picture of the person writing him. And that person is efficient, that person is guarded, and that person is dispassionate. Let me say a little bit about that. Jefferson is efficient because he believes language ought not to be used with exaggeration, with hyperbole, ought not to be inflated. One needs to be efficient. One needs to write things as clearly, as plainly, and as succinctly as is possible. Now, I say that cum grano salis, with a grain of salt, because at the time, the art of letter writing was not necessarily efficient. People wrote very lengthy sentences, and the trend was wordiness at the time. And Jefferson was, if you read his letters, wordy. But nonetheless, compared to other people of his day, he was highly efficient and always aimed, and I say this against Onuf, always aimed at clarity. The only time he might dissemble a little bit is when religious perspectives or deeply political perspectives came into play, and he worried about people opening up his letters at the post office. That was commonly done, especially when he was in Paris, and reading what he had to say and sharing it. And so many people, that happened, especially on religious issues, right? Jefferson was a Unitarian, and he was afraid of his religious views. I say that Unitarianism at the time was multifaceted, but roughly was just a belief in one God, not three gods in one. And but Unitarians differed between themselves quite markedly at the time. So, but Jefferson's views, rejection of the Trinity, for example, rejection of the divinity of Christ and things like that would have been very radical. Had these things got into the news, there would have been some scandal, I suspect. So he didn't want any of that to happen. So he was guarded, right? He often used a cipher in communications with James Madison in the event that his political views might become, letters might be open, his political views might become known, and so forth. He writes to Benjamin Waterhouse when Waterhouse wanted to publish some of Jefferson's letters on religion, and Jefferson replies, "No, my dear sir, not for all the world. Into what a nest of hornets would it thrust my head? I am old, and tranquility is now my summum bonum, my greatest good, my highest good. Keep me, therefore, from the fire and faggots of Calvin and his victim Servetus." Right? Again, Jefferson is dispassionate. He was by nature a stoical, dispassionate person. He very infrequently did he give much display to his emotions. I know of only a couple of incidents that I can recall where he got angry. He just didn't think any of that did any good, and he was right to say that. So his letters were cool and dispassionate because most often his letters were business letters, letters from the presidency. Most of what he did as president was write letters and answer letters, communicate that way, right? He writes to his granddaughter Ellen Coolidge in 1826, just before 1 month before he dies. He says, "It's easier to write 10 letters of business than one of the intangible affections of the mind." Tells you a lot. Jefferson was not wont. Early on in life he was, but he was not wont to reveal himself emotionally. He had difficulty later in life doing that. Not only had difficulty, I think he willfully refrained from being emotional. I don't think he ever saw the value of emotion in daily human living. Okay. So he was businesslike overall because of his dispassionate nature in letters, because he was businesslike in life as a person. Didn't like political debate. He was not good at it either because he was not didn't have a loud, booming voice, and didn't have command of an audience when he spoke. And also, he believed in speaking truthfully. And success in oratory and debate, in large measure, is a matter of pandering to your audience, right? And Jefferson was not only not good at that, I think he thought that was distasteful. Okay. Now, Jefferson became a politician, as I said, dutiful correspondent. Jefferson became a politician not from desire. He said consistently that he hated politics, and I think we need to take him at his word. He did. Why did he become a politician? Because duty called on him. Washington called him to be the Secretary of State. The country called him to be a minister plenipotentiary to France from 1784, 1789. He and he was good at writing political documents, decrees, letters, addresses, and so forth. And he realized that the times were such that the American Revolution was going on early on in his life. Times were such that his country needed him. He was an able and inordinately intelligent and talented person, and duty called him, and he fulfilled his duty. He would rather, as he said a number of times, have been a scientist, someone who studies, a natural scientist, someone who studies the world. Right. I got my cat Viscount Fingal with me up on the desk. He's not getting into the picture though. Right. In terms of Jefferson's capacity to engage with correspondence in a manner that respected most their interests and things like that, Onuf and others, Gordon Reed, have called that an illustration of his chameleon-like nature, an illustration of shiftiness. I certainly disagree. I think that was being respectful. It also showed Jefferson's large intelligence, that he could talk on a variety of subjects and quite intelligently with his correspondence and so forth. I end with a letter earlier on to John Adams, right? 1817. Jefferson writes to Adams on January 11, 1817. Jefferson complains of the number of his correspondence once again, right? And Adams replies, and I think the response from Adams is telling. It's wonderful and telling. He says, well, I avoid excessive correspondence. If someone wants a response, what I do is I give them a rough, a short, and unintelligible, mysterious, enigmatical, or pedantic answers. Right? The idea being I write something so unintelligible and cryptic, mysterious, that the person's definitely not going to communicate with me anymore. Then Adams adds, and this is important, this resource is out of your power because it's not in your nature to avail yourself to it. That to me says everything we need to know about Thomas Jefferson. He might complain later in life about having to write so many letters, but his nature, he felt a duty as a citizen of the American Republic, Empire for Liberty, to answer letters from correspondents. And that, in part, is why I am dedicating this episode to certain of my correspondents, Mr. Coyle, Ms. Hemingway, and Mr. Zolkover, who have written me really nice emails. And I want to thank them for that. And I dedicate this session, which I call Jefferson, the Dutiful Epistolist, to those correspondents of mine. I hope you enjoyed this, and we shall do this again next week. TTFN. I'm at a small Ukrainian village in the background in the middle of winter, by the way. It's quite cozy and charming. So we'll do this again next week. Ta-ta.